So I just wanted to comment on Tucker Carlson's um, interview with Dave Smith, and I, I didn't find Dave that interesting. I guess he's just a topical, commentator like Jimmy Dore. Actually, Jimmy Dore's sidekick is kind of interesting with his, offhand remarks, color commentary. Um, but I guess I don't know. Tucker Carlson has some interesting things to say. Oftentimes it's who he is that's interesting and the way he says it, and kind of brings me back to um, the Western viewpoint, the American viewpoint, the middle class American viewpoint. The Babbitt viewpoint. Excuse me. I guess I look at Tucker as like the decent Babbitt, um, and I guess that's a lot of what the America First movement is decent Babbitts. They want the suckers to have a fair shake. I guess, yeah, and not to die of overdosing on drugs. To not to live out on the sidewalk, etc. And that's commendable. I mean, to the baseline, the minimum, or maybe even below, basically the minimum. Yeah, or in our movement, the actual communist movement historically, sub minimum, is just to have a society. I guess what we're looking at is the uh, logical end of Margaret Thatcher's statement. There is no society. Thatcher and Reagan, and I've even heard some America Firsters talk about F. Reagan. He caused a lot of this, and they're right. Well, he was a symptom. And I'm no deep Marxist theoretician, so I won't try. And it's pretty early in the morning. I think what is it, 8 a.m. here in Moscow, just after. So I won't try to get into the whole deep political economic background of why the last 50 or more years have been the way they have been. Maybe I'll touch on it. I don't know, but I just wanted to say, what I found interesting in this interview, as far as I've watched it, I can't take that much of Dave Smith. I mean, the kind of liberal pablum that he spouts, I don't really have much use for. The selling of vitamins and coffee is pretty hilarious. It just shows the kind of petty Babbitt nature of much of, I guess, especially America. Always selling something. So it's good for you. I have your interest at heart, and give me money, or give me and this other schmuck money for our products, or small little products. So yeah, that's just classical liberal capitalist American Babbittry. But at any rate, so Tucker states that his view of the neocon Zionists, and to a certain extent Nick Fuentes, of collective guilt is antithetical to the Western tradition, to Christianity, to decency. I guess in his personal philosophy, and I can appreciate that, and I think that in a sense, yeah, it was a historical advance. That was your view, Tucker, is basically the view of the liberal capitalist, as they broke from feudalism, and and before that, ancient society, or barbarism. I guess, what was it? Well, it would have been feudalism, barbarism, ancient society, and then, savagery, primitive communism. Um, and by that I mean, for example, historically the American Indian, or, Siberian peoples, or, Europeans, Eurasians, whatever, 10,000 years ago or whatever it was, roaming, the Eurasian steppes, etc. Excuse me. In that case, just whole villages or families or clans would be slaughtered by another clan, basically, I guess, in competition for resources. Yeah. And, the, excuse me, um, but, that, so we superseded that, I guess, yeah, with Christianity in a sense, or Christianity strove to supersede, the collective guilt, the blood guilt. But, well, maybe you're old enough to remember. I certainly am, and grew up around the whole culture post World War II. How could I not? I mean, growing up in the family I grew up in, but. There was a certain sense of the Germans have blood guilt for, the Holocaust, the Judeo-side, and more broadly, World War II, really. And it struck me in England, there was a real 30, 40 or more years ago, I lived over there for 6 months in England, and the hatred of the English, at least the middle class English, the little Englanders that I knew, the hatred of those English for the Germans was still, there. Was still there. So, excuse me. And, but part of that too, yeah, was class based. And it was based in the system. My point would be that you're never going to supersede this kind of ethnic killing. Let's, call it what it is. This kind of, tribal killing, this competition for land and resources, and thus, propaganda absurdities, such as, collective blood guilt. Yeah, that goes along with, the belief, for me, the belief in the Bronze Age sky god, and other superstitions of people who couldn't, control their environment the way we can today now. And, excuse me, so, pollution, speaking of environment, one of the degenerations of capitalism. So, oh boy. So, that's the problem, though, is that when you have a society, like, let's take America as a counterpoint. It's a liberal society. It's a society where individualism and liberalism and Babbittry, the small merchant, I would say cockroach, reigns supreme, and everything is for fucking sale there. Here in Russia, that's not the case. For me, because they don't view me as, a proper Russian, even though I, basically am a Russian, half of me, whatever, and you can debate, that gets in, of course, for you, gets into the question of, dual loyalties, dual citizenship, et cetera. That's another question, but just focusing on, American liberalism, the problem is that, well, I don't know, can you put the genie back in the bottle? Can you, recreate a society that is stable, that is rational, where people don't live on the sidewalks, where people go to jobs that, have some sort of meaning for them, I suppose, maybe. I don't know, ask a factory worker, in the 70s, did their jobs have meaning for them? There's a big question mark on that one. And so that's the problem, though, is the contradictions of capitalism. Like, you're always going to have alienation. I guess you would probably answer, well, you can, moderate that, attenuate that through, you know, maybe hearkening back to your, adopted Swedish background, some sort of social fund, perhaps, or, like some sort of Christian, Christian Hezbollah style, social welfare tied to religion, or, some capitalist cockroach, making, what do they call that? Zakat in Islam, charity, tithing, etc., I guess, in Christianity. So yeah, maybe that's your solution. I mean, it's not mine, but anyway, is in terms of like my experience, I guess, as someone who grew up kind of in two worlds, you could say. I mean, one side was the small American tradition of, living on the frontier, on the border with Canada, intermarrying with the tribes, especially into the 1960s. But even my great-grandfather, his second wife was Ojibwe, otherwise known as Chippewa, up in northern Michigan. So, they are, in a sense, very real Americans of a certain region. But they also were sympathetic to the Wobblies, the anarcho-communists, and, maybe they were sympathetic to the Indian way of life. I mean, my great-grandfather married one. They lived next door to them, and, the cemetery, actually, where my forebears buried is, there's a band of Chippewa Ojibwe living next to the cemetery, decommissioned now, but anyway. And there's Ojibwe, it's Indian country. So, so that is the small primitive communist, world, of which, my family in part comes from. They lived next to, they married into, they subscribed in part, not in whole, but, and they were proletarians, they even experienced hunger and deprivation and death, from the capitalist system. So, at a certain level, I grew up to fucking hate capitalists, just organically. Yeah. So, based on the class struggle historically. So, the other side, similarly, that was the Jewish Taliban side, which for the most part became communist, because they became workers over in the USA, especially. But, they were marginalized over here in what became the Soviet Union, especially in the western part. They were marginalized and oppressed. And, they became socialist, supporters of terror, sort of like the Palestinians fight, the Zionists in Israel-Palestine. Look up Hersh Lakert or Shlomo Schwarzbart. Those were anarchist, Menshevik socialist Jews, or this was even before Menshevism in the case of Lakert. But, he was a terrorist and a Buntist, and, celebrated throughout the Jewish world, all around the world. So, so there is that tradition on that side. And yeah, there was a long-standing tradition of like barbarian honor killings among Jews, killings of apostates, stoning them to death in hellholes of the Cressy. And that was overcome, though, among our people by the highest political development historically that we were involved with, and that the peoples over here, as my great uncle Izzy would say, I'm sure, the peoples over here, that is the October Revolution and the communist movement, small c, and then large c, Stalinist, later on. But in that struggle, there were nationalities, and, that was full of contradictions. And yeah, I would argue that, it at its best, it tended towards a heroic overcoming, especially of the youth, overcoming the old shit, as our prophet Karl Marx, put it. which included blowing up churches. Well, more so synagogues, but even before that, just renouncing, religion, renouncing Nibok, renouncing God for many of the revolutionaries here. And, looking towards a world of universality, like the early Christian movement before it became corrupted by Rome, it was a beautiful, revolutionary movement which superseded the blood guilt in large part. But there still remained, that sort of, back west here, in Belarus, Ukraine, etc., there was a national liberation struggle against the Polish occupiers, imperialists, feudal magnates. And that was very bloody and very brutal, even, and even criminal at times. And that did involve, I guess, I wouldn't even say inadvertently, but it did involve collective guilt. Zionists came out of that environment. In the end, through the genocide, they were subjected to collective punishment. So I think, a lot of that kind of reactionary Zionist, violence is a reflection of the, violence from, the region of what became the Western Soviet Union. And the profound trauma of having everyone, your whole family, all your neighbors, everyone you grew up with, pretty much just wiped away. Their existence was just erased. Just, I don't know how far it was from here. 700 kilometers, 700 kilometers perhaps, 500 miles, 1,000 kilometers perhaps. Yeah, let's call it 1,000 kilometers, about 500 miles west of here. So, so for me, the idea that, America, you begin anew, my experience living in, tragically, I lived in Chicago for 24 years. I had family ties there, and it was the biggest regional city from where one side of my people came. But yeah, that for me, that place was just infested by Aravistes, chief among them the Irish Araviste, then, I viewed the Calabrians and the black Aravistes or Uncle Toms, whatever, as more benign than the Irish or the Mexicans. It's a very complex question, but I think like over here there was a correlation, between nationality, the struggle for a better world. That is a world where, in my view, the workers would exercise, power over all other classes. That in the struggle for that, there would be many people of many different ethnic groups that would be killed, just like over here. And the violence would start, over here it started, I guess, Ukrainian nationalists. They were, revanche. They had, what's the word? They had bad feelings. They had, spite against, the Poles, let's say, or the Jews, or, and some of that was, not ill-placed, not misguided. Some of that, a lot of it was, or some of it was misguided. So, and, in the end, they ended up killing, many innocent people for a reactionary aim, with reactionary partners like the Austrian Hungarians, or followed by the Nazis, followed by the Western imperialists. What? In America, yeah, I just view that as, I support the expulsion of, I guess J.J. Carroll says 50 million illegal migrants, mostly over 95% of whom are just, filthy scabs, strike breaking filth, which, the first international, back to the origins of the communist movement in Europe under Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the second plank of the First International was a ban on the importation of foreign strikebreakers. The first plank was international solidarity. So don't fuck with Venezuela. Don't fuck with Yemen. Don't fuck with Palestine, Iran, Russia, etc. Of course, but don't allow liberal filth to import a horde of you know the horde of shit, not the golden horde, but the horde of shit, to take a crap all over the, as fucked up as it is, the American nation. So yeah, I mean, I would prefer that we deport 100 million, starting with, the worst Yankees and the worst hillbillies and the worst Irish, and moving on down. I'm somewhat sympathetic to, say, Mexicans or Latin Americans on a percentage basis, because the Yankee imperialist scum fucked with their countries, and I was always against that. I always spoke out against that. I always supported the people of Latin America, but then you just get, I was friends with a guy who turned out to be a fucking Mexican Nazi. Like, get the fuck out of my country. Go back to fucking Mexico if you're a Nazi. Or some fucking Sicilian, mafia lesbian. I would deport you if you're lucky. So, and these people, they all have their little fucking ethnic identities, especially in a city like Chicago. And or you mix in these cornfield striver fucks who want to sell out everything. The same thing here in Russia. The polka, they're called polka banas. Those people, if they were lucky, I would gulag them. Just, you don't belong in civilization. You're an uncivilized, opportunist, Arabist piece of shit. Get the fuck out. So, yeah. So, I mean, but a lot of that in general in places like Chicago tracks to, the 11th Ward and the Irish, barbarian criminal filth. As an associate of mine pointed out, all of these filth, like in a place like Illinois, I got the hell out of New York. I couldn't stand it. That's even more reactionary in a lot of ways. But say in like Chicago and Illinois, which I know better, these are ethnic gangs, more or less. And they form up their gang, they capture the political office, they steal as much as they can from the public treasury, they get caught, they go to prison, but meanwhile they hand off the loot to their, co-conspirator, Irish or Mexican or whatever the fuck. And then, when they get out of prison, then, their criminal associates like pay them off, I guess, or, take care of the family. Ugh, disgusting. So, so for me, if we ever had a rebellion, a mass rebellion in America, let alone a revolution, I would say, a lot, like 80% of the Irish would be deported if they were lucky. Like whatever, half the black population in Chicago, deported if they're lucky back to Mississippi, etc. So, so I don't think it's like you don't have necessarily collective blood guilt, but you definitely have tribalism in America. And, that can be broken like it was over here. That's the other thing, is if you're a nationalist over here, you can be locked up, if you're a nationalist extremist, because that's a threat, right, to the cohesiveness of the society overall. So, What else to say? But at the same time, the Russians, and this is Russian land, mostly peasants here. They really don't. They hate Asian Erevist, scabs, barbarians, and just barely tolerate them. Yeah. There are ads and rentals here. No dogs, no Asians. They're very explicit about that. So, there was progress in terms of internationalism under the October Revolution, but then because of the siege and the betrayal of the West, we could only make so much progress. In America, it's a phony liberalism, and I think that liberalism is going to break down. There is already low-level conflict. I experienced it for 24 years. My only regret is I didn't, knock out teeth. I was too tolerant of the barbarians of Chicago. I should have been. I wasn't really violent at all. I should have been violent towards them, the way they were violent towards me. My auntie Olive once said, if someone hits you, you hit them back, and it's time to hit them back. And no more tolerance, no more selling coffee or vitamin supplements. It's time for mass deportations and frankly, more violence than that, in my view. But and then maybe at the other end of it, America could be, I don't know, I really don't know. America's so right wing. It's far beyond what I would imagine. A country that I would want to live in, is. I'll visit America, but whatever. It's just for me, it's a right wing shithole, and incoherent. And the best one could hope for, I guess, is your version of right wing shit. But like over here, it's it's like you came here to Moscow and you cried, you squeezed the bread and cried, and yeah, it's you totally. I was at Vegas Mall last night because my buddy Jimmy loves Vegas and Nevada, and his dad's ashes are even sprinkled behind Bugsy Siegel's statue because his dad was kind of a mobster. but anyway, that's another crazy story. But over here, you have Vegas Mall. They recreated fucking Rockefeller Center with a fucking ice skating rink and all of the, decor. It's a miniature fucking Rockefeller Center there. I worked in Rockefeller Center many years ago. Got fired by these Japanese fascist nihilist scum who should also be shot, basically. Yeah, I wouldn't even, deport them. They're just filth. Why make the Japanese people suffer with filth like that? So is my philosophy. But anyway, it's 1985, splash America here in Moscow. And, that's not my world. My world is 1920 Petrograd, shooting the bourgeoisie. What else? But next to that is Crocus City Hall, where the fucking British filth murdered 300, organized the murder of 300 Russians. Russians who, they're just, the greatest danger from Russia is they're just so fucking adorable. The kids walking around the mall, oh my God, but that's the kind of filth of the West that runs the West, and that supports that filth. Especially all the filth that came over to the West since 1945. There needs to be an intense bloodletting of that kind of filth. We've got a huge pustule that needs to be drained, an abscess in the West that needs to be drained, and frankly, I think that can only really be done through massive violence. The people I was forced to live around in Chicago, there's no other real solution except, either deportation or we kill them. So, I know that, to like a little panty wetter crybaby who, lived in the suburbs his whole fucking life, that sounds extreme, but, I live with this filth, tragically, I did not have a good life. I had to live among that filth. I should have tried my best to get away from it, but in the end, I fled. But yeah. But filth like that, you can hardly, you can basically, under threat of death, you can make them leave. But do you really want to inflict, that filth on India or former Yugoslavia or, wherever the fuck, you know? Yeah, I think, like Robespierre said, mercy to the wicked is cruelty to the innocent. And there are innocent people that have suffered enough in India, in Central America, in Latin America, etc. Yeah, I would not show mercy to these filth, living in America. Yeah. So anyway, but there's a correlation between filth and their tribe, but it's really at base it's kind of political social. So